All right, let's get started. So, hello everyone. My name is Ava Bosco. I'm the Executive Director for the Center County Democratic Committee. I will be your moderator for this evening. Welcome to our webinar today featuring Michael Mann. I would like to quickly introduce Greg Stewart, who is the chair of the CCDC, who would like to say a few words. You'll need to unmute yourself, Greg.
All right, good evening, everybody. This is a new experience for us. Hopefully this will go well. I just want to thank you for supporting the Leadership Circle. Your donations were crucial to the victories we had in 2019. And we're really looking forward to keeping Center County blue in 2020. So I'm going to turn it over to Ava again and start the program.
Great, thank you. So at this time, we would like to invite Kara Package. She is a representative from the Biden campaign to speak for a moment about his race.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kara, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about our campaign. I'm one of the organizers for Biden for President in the Mid-Atlantic region, focusing almost exclusively on Central PA and Northeastern PA. Having grown up in a small town in Washington County, I am thrilled to be collaborating with voters in my home state to make sure that we're solid blue in November. As we're all navigating the new normal amidst a global crisis, it's become clearer and clearer every day that this will be the most important election of our lifetimes. We need leadership that believes in scientists like your speaker this evening, and we need a president who is empathetic, who has experience, and who knows how to bring people together. Vice President Biden has devoted his entire life to public service, and we need him in the White House, not only to restore the soul of the nation, but to move us forward into a better future. Our team has classified Pennsylvania as a win-back battleground state, and we're quickly building momentum. By the end of June, we will have hired 600 new staffers across key states like this one. But what you might be asking is, what is the Biden team doing now in Pennsylvania? Traditional campaigning involves things like rallies and canvassing. We're taking a different now, one that emulates a candidate and meets the needs of the moment. Do we have your vote? Where are you? What's on your mind? Our primary focus right now is community building. How do we support, connect, and empower people? We've hosted hundreds of meetings and completed thousands of acts of kindness in the last 2 months. Campaign ramps up for the general, and the details of the coordinated campaign are figured out. Our organizers are building networks of grassroots volunteers who are eager to lead virtual events, community phone banks, and projects, including a community meeting that's coming up soon in the State College area. In the coming months, we'll move towards persuading undecided voters and then generating voter turnout. And when we do, the volunteers and supporters we're meeting right now will lead that movement. If you'd like to hear more about how we're organizing, or if you have any questions about the campaign, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'd love to speak with you. This election is way too important to sit on the sidelines. And this Sunday at 2 p.m., I'll be hosting a grassroots volunteer training, and I'd love for you to join us. Thank you so much for the work that you're already putting in and for giving me the opportunity to share this.
Great, thank you, Kier. So before we get started, I would just like to quickly go over some of the functions available to you on Zoom. So as you will see at the bottom of your screen, you are able to type in the chat or to ask questions during the Q&A portion through that box. As you can see, all the attendees are not able to show their screen and they are not able to speak. Once we move on to the Q&A portion, I will change that and unmute you so that you can ask questions. You can also raise your hand through the emoji option, which as we can see, we have one of those right now. So if you have any questions, please let us know. And I believe that is about it for me. We will be recording this webinar, so we will send it out in an email to everyone after, and let's get started. So I would like to thank you for your patience, and I'd like to introduce Nancy Chiswick. She is who started this event, and she is the fundraising chair for the Center County Democratic Committee.
Thank you, Ava. I want to ask you to, I see that there are a couple of requests for contact information for Kara, and I wonder if we could get that and send that out to people who registered for this event and have it generally available. Ava, would you be able to do that? Thank you very much. Again, my name is Nancy Chiswick, and I am the fundraising chair for Center County. The name of the group that you've joined in order to be here today is the 21st Century Leadership Circle. And we have a lot of work to do and a lot of good times to spend together too. We're honored to have Michael Mann as our featured guest this evening. He's here to talk about one of the largest challenges facing us today, dealing with climate change while navigating a political environment that promotes climate change denial. Dr. Mann is our neighbor, and he's also a world-renowned climate scientist. He's published a multitude of papers in scholarly journals and has received numerous awards and distinctions, including just a few weeks ago, Mike told me that he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. He's also part of the group that received the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He's listed in Bloomberg News' list of the 50 most influential people in 2013. He received a Friend of the Planet Award, the Friend of the Planet Award of 2014, and the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2019. Mike is well known for this book, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy, which discusses climate denialists and how they have manipulated the media for their own business and political interests, and how this feeds into the partisan politics that we see today. Today, Mike will present his thoughts and research, and later he will answer questions. Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nancy and Ava and Greg. It's great to be here with you all tonight to talk about this challenge, this crisis we face in human-caused climate change, and the implications that it has for our politics and for arguments for supporting, in particular, the Democratic Party, which has displayed some actual leadership on this issue when we lack that sort of leadership today at the national level under the current administration. So let me go into, and my, you should be seeing my first overhead here. How to Win the New Climate War. This is actually the title of my next book, and it's about how, as we sort of get past the outright denial of the facts, the basic facts, it's increasingly difficult to argue against the proposition that we are warming the planet and changing the climate, given that we are seeing the impacts firsthand in real time on our television screens, in our newspaper headlines. And so instead, the forces of denial and delay have sort of moved on to a softer form of climate denialism, an effort to, again, to delay, to deflect attention from the real solution, which is to decarbonize our economy, and to do everything in their power to prevent us from making that necessary transition away from the burning of fossil fuels to renewable energy to a carbon-free economy. Well, first of all, just the basic science. You know, the critics accuse climate scientists of being alarmists and overstating the problem. So what I like to do is to actually show a prediction back from actually 1977, a prediction of the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations and the warming that would be expected to result from that increase, all the way into the future. The red lines intersect where we are today at 2020 with a CO2 level of almost 420 parts per million and a warming since the late 1970s.
Mike,
yeah.
I'm going to interrupt you. Your screen isn't sharing. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I forgot to share screen. How about now?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, sorry, folks. So we didn't really miss anything. This is the prediction, ExxonMobil's own prediction, or Exxon at the time, in the late 1970s, of the warming that would be expected and the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations that would be expected into the future if we continued with business as usual. And what's so remarkable is that not only were they able to predict the warming, which was the better part of a degree Celsius, and if you add that to the warming that had already occurred, basically where we are now at a little more than 1 degree Celsius warming, the better part of 2 degrees Fahrenheit warming. Not only did they predict that warming, they predicted the increase in carbon dioxide concentrations, which resulted only because we didn't take action. Because ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests who had a stake in us not moving away from fossil fuels did everything in their power to prevent us from transitioning away from fossil fuels. And that's why we are where we are today. So it's really a remarkable prediction. Their own scientists predicted where they would be. Now, where we would be if we failed to act. And up to now, we have not taken the action necessary to avert catastrophic warming of the planet. This is a diagram that shows the carbon emissions over time historically. And here you see up to 2000. If we had followed that blue curve down, if we had flattened the curve, as we now say, and brought our carbon emissions down over the last couple decades, when we knew we had a problem, when we knew it was time to act, it would have been fairly easy to avoid warming the planet beyond a dangerous 1.5 degrees Celsius, the better part of 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as we see, the longer you delay and fail to take action, the steeper that curve, that cliff. I think of it as sort of going from a bunny slope to a double diamond ski slope. And what we have to do now, because we failed to act 2 decades ago when it would have been easy, is we have to come way down that slope very dramatically. Our carbon emissions have to come down very dramatically if we are to prevent a warming of more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. That's the cost of inaction. That's the cost of the disinformation campaign that was waged by ExxonMobil and other fossil fuel interests for decades that prevented us from taking action when it would have been relatively easy. And the impacts, again, we don't have to use our imagination anymore. Wildfires that range from the Amazon to the Arctic. Florida, you may have read over the past couple weeks, Florida is dealing with wildfires. This is, we're used to hearing about wildfire danger in California, but now we're seeing it in Florida. And in fact, our own group, as you can see here, a couple years ago, published an article where we demonstrated the expected drying, in addition to warming, of Florida that will be expected under business as usual burning of fossil fuels. That's the future that we face, and we're already seeing a glimpse of that future. Record heat waves, again, wildfires, floods, superstorms. 2020, January 2020 was the warmest year the warmest month on record. This year may break yet another record for the warmest year on record. So global warming continues apace as we continue to burn carbon. And the impacts are no longer subtle, as I've alluded to. We see them playing out in real time in the form of unprecedented extreme weather disasters, including here in State College, Pennsylvania, here in central Pennsylvania a couple summers ago, where we saw unprecedented rainfall. It was associated with the same large-scale pattern that you see here on the left of the jet stream, where the jet stream sort of crashes down in the eastern US, and that means you've got a low pressure system, you've got rising atmospheric motion and rainfall, and we had record rainfall because of that very stable pattern. Out west, where there's instead what you call a ridge, you get high pressure, hot conditions, dry conditions, and indeed that was the year where California saw the worst wildfires on record. And so we're seeing this behavior of the jet stream where it sort of gets stuck in these extreme configurations. And when that happens, you get these weather extremes, these very persistent weather extremes like we've seen in recent years. Our own work shows that climate change is actually favoring that tendency of the jet stream to get stuck in one of these undulating patterns. And here's the bad news. The climate models don't actually capture that effect. The climate models are imperfect. They don't capture all of the physics of the real atmosphere. They are only an approximation of how the atmosphere works. And as a result, there's some features that they don't capture. And they're not capturing that effect of global warming that's causing the jet stream to slow down and the jet stream to start to undulate in this characteristic pattern, which is giving us these unprecedented weather disasters. So if anything, our models are actually underestimating some of the impacts that climate change is already having when it comes to extreme weather disasters. And it's not rocket science. You warm up the planet, you get more heat waves, you dry out the soils and the surface, so you get worse drought and heat. You put them together, you get worse wildfires, and a warmer atmosphere holds more moisture, so when it does rain, you get larger amounts of it in short periods of time, i.e. more flooding. And that is indeed the face of climate change. We are now seeing it play out in real time here in the United States or in Australia, where I did a sabbatical beginning last December. That sabbatical was supposed to last through May. I ended up coming home early because of the coronavirus threat. But when I arrived in Australia to do a sabbatical, which involved a collaboration with Australian scientists to understand the linkage between climate change and extreme weather events in Australia, a project that was planned out 2 years ago. Little did I realize that when I arrived for that sabbatical in Australia, I would be witnessing the worst extreme weather events that Australia has ever observed. And of course, we've read about the catastrophic bushfires that literally spread around the continent. It literally felt like the continent was on fire. In my apartment in Sydney, I could smell the smoke and see the smoke in the air. There were times when I wasn't very far away from some active bushfires. And so I was literally on the front lines of witnessing the devastating impacts of climate change, and ended up spending most of my time not doing research, but talking about it, trying to provide the Australian people the context for understanding the unprecedented weather disasters that they were seeing. Now, there has been, as I've alluded to, this war on the science, this effort to thwart the transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy by fossil fuel interests and conservative politicians in their pay and doing their bidding. And at times it can lead to some almost amusing displays. And here I want to play a segment from a House hearing. This was the House Science Committee back in 2016, or 2017 rather, March 2017. I testified at this hearing. The chair of the committee was Lamar Smith, a climate change denier from Texas, who was the chair of the House Science Committee, somebody who rejects the overwhelming consensus of the world scientists and held a hearing to try to discredit the science of climate change. I was the only witness called by the Democrats to defend the overwhelming consensus of the world scientists, and there were 3 other witnesses who were all invited by the Republicans to try to discredit the science.
According to an article that came out a few days ago in the journal Science, Chairman Smith was on record at the Heartland Institute. This is a climate change denying Koch brothers funded outlet that has a climate change denier conference every year. And Chairman Smith spoke at that conference.
Dr. Mann, don't mischaracterize that.
Well, let me finish my.
No, they do not say that they are deniers, and you should not say that they are either.
Well, we can have that discussion. I'd be happy to. Let me finish my
be
statement.
accurate in your description.
I stand by my statement, but can I finish my point?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Yes. So he indicated at this conference that he, according to science, and I'm quoting from them, he sees his role in this committee as to a tool to advance his political agenda rather than a forum to examine important issues facing the U.S. research community. As a scientist, I find that deeply disturbing.
Dr. Mann, who said that?
This is according to Science Magazine, one of the most respected outlets when it comes
and
to
who are they
science.
quoting?
This is the author, Jeffrey Mervis, who wrote that article. I'd be happy to send to committee the article.
That is not known as an objective writer or magazine.
Well, it's Science Magazine.
Okay, so there you are in this upside down world. This black is white, up is down world of climate change denial, where Science Magazine, the most respected scientific journal in the country, and you might argue in the world, is considered a biased source by Lamar Smith, who you might not be surprised to learn is a major recipient, or was a major recipient, of fossil fuel money. He has since stepped down. The Republicans, of course, lost the House of Representatives, and instead, that committee is now chaired by Bernice Johnson, who actually has a background in science, I believe in nursing, an African-American woman who has sort of restored the role of science and science-based thinking and decision-making to that committee. So elections really do have consequences. Lamar Smith is no longer chairing that committee. In Australia, again, where I did my sabbatical, they too have some politicians who continue to deny the scientific evidence. And I'm going to play a segment from a program of the Australian Broadcast Corporation called Q&A. It's sort of a national forum where they bring various thought leaders together to discuss issues that are in the forefront of the public discourse. And in this case, in the wake of the bushfires, their first episode of the season was a panel discussion of the bushfires and what to do about them. And one of the panelists, Jim Molan, was from the Liberal Party, which means the opposite of what liberal means in the United States. In Australia, the Liberals are actually the Conservatives. It gets a little bit confusing. And so they currently have a governing coalition. The Liberals under Scott Morrison currently control the government. So they have a conservative government under Scott Morrison, and Jim Molan is one of their conservative senators. And he, as you will see here, does not accept the science.
You get information across your desk every day, which leads you to doubt or be open-minded about the science. I am open-minded about information. Oh, it's a range of information which goes. It's a range of. Thank you. Sorry, we just respectfully listen to this. Yeah, thank you. Just trying to get to the bottom of this. What is the evidence that you are relying on? I'm not relying on evidence, Hamish. I am saying. You said it. But this is why my mind is open. I would love to be convinced one way or the other, but to be prudent, what the government is doing is it's got a climate and emissions reduction policy, and it is a good policy, and it will mitigate risk to the maximum that it can. And where risk cannot be mitigated, it will adapt. And that's what we've got to work on, is adaptation.
Yeah, come on now, mate.
And he's an American.
Now, you should keep an open mind, but not so open that your brain falls out.
So, of course, it's a famous line that was used by Carl Sagan decades ago. And it sort of underscores how ridiculous it is in today's world when there's such an overwhelming consensus among the world's scientists to say you have an open mind, as if you're being open-minded by rejecting the overall consensus of the world's scientists in favor of, misinformation and disinformation and denialism. This audience was actually all from the local Canberra, the capital city, from that area that had been greatly impacted by the bushfires. And I don't think they took kindly to a senator rejecting the role that climate change is playing in this catastrophe that they have personally witnessed and had to deal with. But what you heard there was an effort to equivocate. I'm not sure if there's, if there's compelling scientific evidence. And by the way, we'll just adapt to it. And this is one of the emerging themes, and we'll see that again. sort of deflection away from the real solution, which is decarbonizing our economy, getting off fossil fuels, and instead talking about how we'll simply somehow adapt to the changes that we are causing. Okay. Now, so what I call the new climate war is, as you know, there still are the Lamar Smiths and the Jim Mullins of the world who reject the scientific evidence either entirely or partly. But by and large, we're seeing an evolution away from denialism because the impacts have become so obvious that it just isn't credible to deny it's happening. So we've seen this evolution away from sort of hard denial to soft denial. Well, it's not going to be that bad. And by the way, we can innovate our way out of the problem, or we'll adapt. And by the way, we don't need to impose any new policies or any regulations on industry. This is just a matter of individuals being better citizens. The solution isn't regulation. It isn't economic incentives to move our economy away from fossil fuel burning. It's up to all of us individually to somehow solve this problem. This is a common theme now. Now you do see arguments, you know, here a couple examples in Australia. You know, the warming is good for us, says Andrew Bolt, who writes for the Rupert Murdoch-owned Herald Sun in Australia. And so the Murdoch media empire played an important role, a very dominant role in rejecting the notion that climate change was playing any part in the unprecedented weather disasters they were dealing with. And they brought in people like Bjorn Lomborg, who's sort of a professional climate change denier and diminisher. He denies that climate change is behind many of these impacts we're dealing with, including the Australian bushfires. And he's supported by groups associated with the Koch brothers. And anytime there is, you know, some climate-related disaster playing out, you can be sure that they'll bring in Bjorn Lomborg to go on record, to appear on television and be quoted in the newspapers denying any connection between climate change and these events that are playing out. And then delay. Well, you know, the argument is we don't need to introduce new regulations which will, you know, hurt our economy. The argument always is. Of course, the irony is that climate change is doing far more damage to our economy than any of these regulations would possibly do. It costs much more not to act on climate than it costs to act. And an argument can be made, actually, that there are far more jobs and a far more healthy economy if we move away from outdated, antiquated fossil fuel infrastructure to clean energy infrastructure. Will actually grow the economy. There will be more jobs. So it's a false argument, the idea that this will hurt the economy, but this is the argument that they use, and then they say it's much easier to just adapt. So you've got people like Marco Rubio telling the people of Florida that somehow they'll just adapt to the encroaching seas and the more devastating hurricanes that they are now dealing with. And I guess he means they'll grow gills and fins, because I don't know how else you're going to adapt to the inundation of our coastlines. Scott Morrison of Australia, their prime minister, making similar arguments that the solution is to just adapt, somehow deal with the problems that climate change is causing. And then there's deflection. And many of you, I think, many of my viewers will recognize this commercial from when you were growing up, if you're, you know, my generation or older, the famous Crying Indian PSA, public service announcement, that taught us that, you know, that we were the solution to the pollution problem. The cans and bottles that were strewn throughout our countryside, on roadsides and rivers. It was because of us, because we weren't being good citizens. And the solution was to be better citizens, to be stewards of our environment. It was very inspiring to a whole generation. I was inspired by this commercial to care about pollution, to want to be a better citizen. What I didn't realize was that it was actually a propaganda campaign hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola and the beverage industry. They were faced with the proposition of an array of bottle bills passing in states around the country, which would require them to recycle and process their bottles and cans. It would be much better for the environment, but it would be more expensive for them. And so what they did was to invest in a major advertising campaign, bringing in Burson Marsteller, a major Madison Avenue firm, and even conning some environmental groups like the Sierra Club into initially supporting this project until they realized they had been had, until they realized that in fact this was an effort by the beverage industry to deflect attention away from the real systemic solution, recyclable and refillable bottles, recycling, reuse, and instead simply deflect the attention to the responsibility of individuals not to litter the countryside with their bottles and cans. It was a deflection from a systemic solution to the argument that we as individuals are the ones who have to fix this problem. And this is what, so we were had. Those of you who grew up watching this commercial, to me, I feel like part of the innocence of my youth was stolen from me in realizing that this was actually just a propaganda campaign by Coca-Cola and the beverage industry. And the result of that campaign is one of the other great global environmental problems we face today, the problem of global plastic pollution, because they were successful in thwarting efforts to solve this problem systemically. Well, the fossil fuel industry is doing exactly the same thing right now. And too often, they're able to get media outlets like the New York Times to play right into it. The New York Times is replete with articles about all the things that we can do as individuals to lower our carbon footprint. In fact, the notion of an individual carbon footprint was originally promoted by BP as a way to get us to focus on our responsibility rather than the need to get away from fossil fuels, to get away from oil and natural gas and coal. And so we continue to be bombarded by propaganda telling us that we alone are the solution to climate change. It's up to us as individuals. We don't need policies. We don't need a price on carbon. We don't need subsidies and incentives for renewable energy. We just need to stop using plastic straws and stop eating hamburgers. Elizabeth Warren, you might remember from one of the Democratic debates, really put her finger on this. She was the one candidate who really had a very clear explication of this problem. This is what the fossil fuel industry wants us talking about. Our straws and our cheeseburgers, when 70% of the carbon that we're throwing into the air comes from three industries, fossil fuel industry. So I've myself have written a number of commentaries over the last year or so, co-authored a commentary with my Penn State colleague, Jonathan Brockup, some of you may know him, about this deflection campaign. Yes, we should all do things that make us better stewards, that decrease our carbon footprint. In many cases, it saves us money, makes us healthier, we feel better, we're setting a good example for others. We should all do those things, but we should not think that this is a substitute for the necessary systemic solution, which is putting a price on carbon, providing explicit incentives for renewable energy to accelerate the transition that's already underway away from fossil fuels to renewable energy. So lots of things we can do to decrease our personal carbon footprint, but we need policies. In Australia, back to my experiences in Australia, I had the pleasure of meeting the mayor of Sydney several times, Clover Moore, who's a wonderful mayor who's really made it a focal point of her time as mayor to help this transition, help Australia in this transition towards a cleaner economy and a carbon-free economy. And so the Murdoch media has targeted her by claiming, for example, that her office was using huge amounts of carbon in their activities, in their travel activities. She had actually attended a talk that I gave back in October 2019, where I talked about the deflection campaign and the way the fossil fuel industry is trying to deflect attention away from the systemic changes that are necessary to individual behavior. And she recognized that she was being targeted by the Murdoch media in precisely that way. As you can see in this Facebook post, she even referred to, what climate scientist Michael Mann refers to as deflection. She was actually the subject, the object rather, of an effort by the Murdoch media empire to deflect attention away from the need for the Australian government to support policies to decarbonize the economy and make it sound like the real problem is the mayor and other people who are just profligate in their personal behavior. And by the way, the documents that they provided to the Murdoch media empire to make that charge by the energy minister, Angus Taylor, it turns out that they were forged documents, and that led to a huge scandal and a call for him to step down. They actually made stuff up in their effort to tar the mayor of Sydney to try to deflect attention away from the need of the government to actually do something about climate change. And the Murdoch media empire here in the United States, of course, has played a critical role in the effort to deny climate change and the effort to prevent action on climate in the form of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, and the rest of that empire. Another problem, another sort of component of this new climate war is despair mongering, doomism. If you truly believe that it's too late to do anything, then why do anything? And we have sort of cult figures now in the climate movement like Guy McPherson, who insists that we will all be extinct in 10 years, no matter what we do, all life on the planet will end. It's too late to do anything about climate change. And that, of course, is nonsense. There's no scientific rationale for that claim whatsoever. But what makes it so pernicious is that it actually leads people who might otherwise want to do something about this problem. It's not targeting people on the right side of our political spectrum. It's actually targeting people on the left, trying to convince them that there is nothing we can do about climate change. And if there's nothing we can do, then why support policies, for example, to decarbonize our economy? This, in my view, is one of the great threats that we face right now when it comes to action on climate, is despair mongering, the idea that it's too late to do anything. And we've seen this promoted in leading magazines like the New Yorker, New York Magazine. This has become an all too common refrain. Here's from an op-ed I wrote a couple of years ago about how doomsday scenarios are as dangerous as outright denial of climate change, because it potentially leads us down that same path of inaction. Well, it would be an oversight if I didn't mention in this context Michael Moore's recent film. Some of you may have heard of this film. He released it on Earth Day on YouTube because he couldn't find a distributor, incidentally, for the film. And this is Michael Moore, of course, known as a progressive firebrand who has argued for progressive causes through his career. And yet, his most recent film is a full-throated attack against renewable energy. And it's been embraced by fossil fuel interests and Koch brothers funded groups and the right, because it does two things. It deflects attention from the true solution, which is renewable energy, getting off fossil fuels. It also deflects attention away from systemic solutions to individuals. The one solution to the problem that he argues for, that Moore, who was the producer, and then Jeff Gibbs, the director, argue for, is population control. And implicit is that it's people in other countries in the developing world that are the source of the problem. And that has sort of racial overtones that are troubling on a number of levels. So, when it comes to this effort to get off fossil fuels and to act on climate, sometimes the villains are people we thought are to be heroes, and the heroes are portrayed as villains, which was the title of my own commentary on this film, published recently in Newsweek. So we have to be aware of the fact that there are people, even on the left side of the spectrum, who in some ways are being played by the right and by the fossil fuel industry in an effort to divide progressives on this issue. The fossil fuel industry understands that if they can win conservatives and then divide progressives, well, then they've won. Then they have sort of a governing coalition for inaction. So there are efforts for them to try to undermine support within the progressive community for action on climate. And unfortunately, I don't know what Michael Moore's motives are, but his effort plays right into that. So winning the war, and I realize time is winding down here, so I won't belabor the point. The solution, we know what it is. It's getting off fossil fuels, and there's great urgency. We need to do this quickly. We've already seen we've got to come down the slope of that curve very steeply now because of decades of relative inaction. So there's great urgency in acting now, but there is agency. There are things that we can, in fact, do to avert the worst impacts of climate change. And that's very important at a time when we do see so much despair mongering. And there are good stories to, good news stories to be told in Australia, here in the US, where renewable energy topped coal in the US for 40 straight days. You might have seen this headline recently. And part of that has to do with the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown and social distancing. But it also means that we might be in a moment now where we have an opportunity to sort of rethink our practices and move towards a more sustainable economy. Fossil fuels, for the first year, carbon emissions didn't go up. For the first year in several years, carbon emissions didn't go up last year. And for the first year, sometimes carbon emissions flatten out for a year or two, and it has to do with a downturn in economic activity. Not true last year. The International Energy Agency looked at the reason for the flattening of carbon emissions, and they were able to attribute it to the increasing role of renewable sources of energy, mainly wind and solar. So we are seeing an increasing impact of renewable energy that is displacing carbon energy. We're on the right track. We're flattening the curve, but you saw the problem. Flattening the curve, in this case, isn't enough. We've got to come down the other side of that curve dramatically. So we're headed in the right direction. We're starting to bend that curve downward, but we need to do much more. And that's the argument really for why, personal behavioral changes alone aren't going to solve this problem. And I'll come back to that in a moment. We have this worldwide youth climate movement, which has really changed the conversation. Greta Thunberg, who many of you have heard of, Alexandra Vilsanor, who's an American, a 15-year-old girl who has also helped lead this movement here in the United States to draw attention to the necessity of the adults in the world, us, not engaging in behavior that mortgages the planet for them, for our children and our grandchildren. And there's still time to do that. And I think the youth climate movement has helped refocus this problem where it needs to be. It's not just about economics or science or policy. This is about ethics, intergenerational ethics, us not leaving behind a degraded planet for our children and grandchildren. And of course, these, because of the impact that they're having, they've attracted, as I like to say, the eye of Sauron. OPEC has declared these kids as the greatest threat to the fossil fuel industry now in the world. And that means that we have to have their backs. They are, in the crosshairs now of the climate change denial machine. And we have to make sure that their efforts aren't in vain. We can't leave this on the children. They've sort of helped crack open the door. They've given us a foot in the door, and now it's our responsibility to take that opportunity and engage in the actions necessary to decarbonize our economy. The COVID-19 crisis has been an interesting opportunity, as I said before, to sort of rethink our priorities. There's just a headline, you may have read this today, a study that just came out today in the journal, was it Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, I think? No, it was one of the Nature journals, Nature Climate Change. The numbers are now in, at least for the first several months of the year. And the estimate is that we saw global carbon emissions at the peak of the pandemic in April drop by about 17%. For the year, the estimate is that they'll be down about 3 to 4%. So that sounds good. That means carbon emissions have actually dropped, and they're going to be lower this year by 3 to 4%. But here's the thing, and essentially, you know, a lockdown of the global economy, all the social distancing, you know, what feels like a very dramatic change in our lifestyle, basically the end of, you know, air travel for most individuals. These dramatic changes have only bought us 3 to 4% drop in carbon emissions. And so I'm quoted in this article making this point. You know, this underscores a simple truth. Individual behavior alone won't get us there. What we need is fundamental structural change. Just flying less, traveling less, those sorts of individual changes aren't going to get us the carbon emissions that we need. We need 10% decrease in carbon emissions every year for the next 10 years. And this is only going to get us about 4% for the year. So one of the lessons to draw away from this is, yes, personal behavior can help us make a dent. Our personal practices, our individual practices can help decrease our carbon footprint and our collective carbon emissions, but we need structural change. We need policies that will incentivize those changes. And that means we need politicians who will support those policies, which brings me to the key point here. This is our current president on both climate change and coronavirus.
Obama's talking about all of this with the global warming and that a lot of it's a hoax. It's a hoax. I mean, it's a money-making industry. Okay. Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus. You know that, right? Coronavirus. And this is their new hoax. Today, the World Health Organization officially announced that this is a global pandemic.
Oh, sorry, didn't mean to. So, okay, you know, with climate change, the impact of science-denying politicians is maybe more subtle. It's hard to understand. It's hard to put our finger on the direct impact that that's having. With coronavirus, it's very clear. The policies of this administration, the estimates are going to lead to potentially hundreds of thousands of additional deaths because they didn't act in time to slow the spread of the pandemic. We're seeing tens of thousands more deaths and what might amount in the end to hundreds of thousands of deaths. So here the connection between denial of science and policies that deny science that might be inconvenient to the economic interests at play. We've seen the death and the loss that that causes. And so perhaps that will help us to better appreciate the true danger of having politicians who would rather do the bidding of polluting interests and the powerful special interests that run their campaigns, that fund their campaigns, rather than what's right for the people they're supposed to represent. And so that brings us to the final message here. You know, we have an opportunity in November to make a change. It's not too late for us to shift gears, to get rid of this president who denies that climate change is happening, who has essentially outsourced his energy and environment policies to the fossil fuel industry, which has been busy dismantling the environmental protections of the last 50 years. As we're distracted by the Circus Act of Donald Trump and coronavirus and everything else, they are busy using this as an opportunity to literally dismantle all of the environmental protections that we have that we've worked towards for a half a century. And given another 4 years, it's likely that we will be looking at irreversible damage, not just on our country, but on the planet, irreversible environmental damage. And we may well commit to catastrophic warming of the planet, given another 4 years of these policies. So this next election couldn't be more important. Democrats are on the right side of this problem. Right now, the Republican Party has pretty much gotten behind Donald Trump and his policies. So the decision is fairly simple. If you care about this planet, if you care about the future of our children and grandchildren, there's only one party that seems to prioritize that, and that's the Democratic Party. And we have to elect Democrats from president all the way down to dog catcher. And somewhere in between is my good friend, Peter Buckland, who's running for state representative, local state representative, and has been a real leader on this issue. So we need to turn the vote out. We need to make sure that people come out and vote for this election and vote all the way down the ticket for Democrats so that we get back the Senate, that we keep the House, we get a Democratic president, and finally we might have an opportunity to reassert leadership on these issues, the issue of human-caused climate change and issues of environmental sustainability. We might actually return to the leadership position that this country once occupied under Barack Obama. And so that's my plea. Let's elect Democrats. Let's do everything we need to do locally and nationally to elect Democrats. I'm not even going to pretend not to have a partisan view on this because it's very clear. The parties are very clear now on where they stand on this issue, and the Republicans have chosen to be on the wrong side. Just in closing, there's our daughter. It's a polar bear. She'll be fine. She's not being tortured by a polar bear. It's at the Pittsburgh Zoo. You can walk on through this plexiglass tube underneath the polar bear feeding pool. And I'd hate for her to face a future where these magnificent creatures no longer exist in the